Yeah, I think it's been probably about 6 now.
6 months. See, times fly when you're having fun. But thank you so much, Troy. Thank you for taking some of your time to take and answer our guest questions because they vary. Do you have anything you would like to say
This
to
is a demonstration
add
of
on to that?
Wirecast.
Thank you, Tony. Yeah, I'm just excited to be here. I'm excited to be able to talk about some very important issues and questions that people have in regard to not only addictive behavior and especially sexual addictions, but also just other topics that are related to sexuality and other mental health types of issues. So I'm happy to do that. Of course, I guess I would remind everybody who's joining us
This is
now
a
that
demonstration of Wirecast.
the live Q&A always presents some interesting challenges to try to find the right words at times to be able to answer those difficult questions because some of them are difficult. So I'd appreciate your understanding as I may pause to think about an answer for you, but I'll certainly do my best, and I'm just excited to be here.
All righty. Well, and I am kind of the behind the scenes guy, and we'll be sending out. I'm tweeting, I'm doing the stuff here. So if I run a little behind, I apologize. But our whole focus, our whole goal is to answer your questions, so let's get right to it. The first question we have, it says, I believe part of the reasons I am addicted to porn of all sorts is that I am also attracted to people of my gender, even though I have no desire to be in such a relationship. I believe but to be truly free from porn, I need to work through these emotions with the help of a therapist. Another school of thought says sin is sin, and I need not dwell so much on why I sin repeatedly and instead decide really does not matter why. What is your thoughts on this?
Well, so it sounds like the question is, there's some complex ideas there, but it sounds like one of the questions is, how do I manage the emotion of not wanting to act on some sexual urges related to use of pornography and even some same-gender attraction kinds of urges? Because for that person, it sounds like it doesn't really reconcile with, or may not reconcile with their value system to engage in those activities. And so one of the things that I would talk about in regard to that is that definitely the therapeutic experience can certainly be a huge help in being able to make sense of that emotion and make sense of those challenges that are faced. It's interesting that many of us will face certain things that feel very difficult to manage, emotions and triggers and things that, whether it's a sexual nature or whether it's anger management or whether it's an urge to use a substance or whatever. There's a lot of similarities in terms of how the brain is operating. The brain tries to reconcile essentially two different things. It tries to reconcile instinctual urges or triggers that come from the limbic part of the brain, and it tries to reconcile that with the logic and the values-driven part of the brain, kind of the executive part of the brain in the prefrontal cortex. And so there are times when the prefrontal cortex, the logic part of the brain, will tell us, that behavior is not what you want. And you would try to make choices to not engage in that behavior. Meanwhile, it battles with the instinctual urges that may come. And they're built into a different part of the brain. And so you have kind of a tug of war going on between those two parts of the brain. And because the emotions are tied into the limbic part of the brain that also has the instincts processing along with it, they're tied very closely together. So very quickly we learn that if we engage in an instinctual behavior, such as a sexual behavior, the emotions that come with that, whether good or bad, will be tied together very strongly. And so that's why there's such a powerful challenge in trying to manage those things. So certainly, number one, understanding that is a huge help, and number two, being able to just simply process the emotions that come along with that struggle can be very beneficial, and that's why therapy is such a huge help.
This
It can
is a
really
demonstration
bring
of
out
Wirecast.
the emotion itself and really target that. And we develop what we call emotional intelligence, which is understanding what drives our emotions and why we act the way we do based on having those emotions. And simply having that understanding can really help us to have more peace as we understand that it's a human condition. It's part of being a human being to have those emotional things. And while it's difficult to have that tug of war,
This is a
there is
demonstration of
definitely the
Wirecast.
opportunity to find greater peace within that and abilities to manage not only the emotions but also the behavior and kind of find that peace and that reconciliation.
Okay, thank you very much. I always forget to do a little bit of housekeeping. Can everybody hear us okay? Please let us know. Type in okay in the chat box that we can make sure that we're not, rambling on without people able to hear us. Getting some okays, good. All right. Okay,
This is
looks
a
like we're good to
demonstration
go
of
then.
Wirecast.
Great.
Next question is it even possible for someone to recover from addiction? Or is it so ingrained that only a select few are able to do it?
Oh, very, very deep question there, certainly. Thank you for that honest question. I think, number one, the simple answer is yes. It is very possible to recover from addiction. It happens all the
This
time.
is a demonstration
Now,
of
when we say
Wirecast.
recovery, I think it's important to also understand what recovery means. I think, many years ago, if you were to go back, say, 15, 20 years, even maybe within the last 10 years, you'd probably find a lot more definitions of recovery. And, some people would say, well, you sort of graduate from the process of dealing with that addiction and then you never face that again.
This is a demonstration
More
of
and more studies
Wirecast.
show and more experiences show through the therapeutic process that the reality is recovery is a lifelong management process. And so, yes, recovery can happen. Absolutely, it can happen. There are great people who recover or are in the process of recovery throughout their lives and feel like they've definitely accomplished amazing things in that process, meaning that they can manage that behavior. I think it's important
This
to
is a
know that,
demonstration of
especially
Wirecast.
with something like sexual addiction that involves such a very core element of our human, limbic processes, that the ability to manage that behavior is in fact a lifelong requirement because it's ingrained in us. The sexual response is part of who we are, and so knowing that that is part of being a human being, that's literally attached to our survival instincts as human beings. Knowing that can help us
This
to
is a
to
demonstration of
understand the nature of
Wirecast.
it being a long-term, lifelong process. But definitely, I think what really is important to know about in terms of recovery is that you can find peace. That's the bottom line that I think most people would say that would more often than not would actually define recovery is, can I manage the behavior and can I find peace? And so I would definitely say without a doubt you can find peace and you can find the ability to manage that, be able to balance
This is a demonstration of Wirecast.
brain-oriented, the limbic responses that come with that sexual behavior and that sexual instinct, to feel good about it, to feel positive, to feel like there's hope and there's progress, a lifelong process that can happen that brings great peace and balance in one's life. You can, essentially manage it to the point where the negative consequences that come with addiction can be essentially
This
mitigated
is a
so that
demonstration
there
of
is great peace and
Wirecast.
balance and happiness in life. So, very good question. I think that comes with a lot of concern that individuals who struggle for a long time are not able to feel like they're making progress. Some of that, I guess I would kind of branch over into another area to answer that question. Some of that has to do with the idea of willpower. Many people will struggle with willpower. Willpower is useful to an extent, but it has
This is a
we
demonstration of
can sort of
Wirecast.
white knuckle it, as we call it, to do our best to get through something, and sometimes we may be successful and other times not. And so the idea behind recovery in a therapeutic sense is that it's not just a matter of holding tight and using willpower to get through a trigger or a situation that's difficult. It's definitely gaining abilities beyond just a willpower to be able to find greater peace with that.
I want to echo that because
This is a
just in the experience
demonstration
that
of
I've had helping with
Wirecast.
people online, I've seen tremendous, absolutely tremendous success with people who say that they weren't going to be able to do that. How could we help them? And then we just told them, give us a try. I mean, it's not going to hurt you. And they did, and now some of them are 2, 3, 4 years sobriety of not actually even acting out, which is phenomenal, especially with somebody who's gone 52 years of continuous
This
acting
is a
out. So
demonstration of
can you find
Wirecast.
recovery? Absolutely. I echo that 100%. Okay, this then kind of relates to the first question. I'm a straight man, but attracted to transsexual or gay porn. Why?
Well, very good question. There's a lot that we're currently learning about this area in terms of same-gender attraction or activities that relate to same-gender activities.
This is a demonstration of
I guess I
Wirecast.
would first say that there's still a lot that we're learning about that as studies are carried out and as we gain a greater understanding of the nature of same-gender attraction. Ultimately, the answer to why that would ever be appealing to anybody is essentially the same answer as why any kind of a sexual experience is appealing, which is that it comes from a natural instinctual part of the brain. It's built in. So many people are familiar
This
with
is a
kind of two
demonstration
parts
of
of the brain that we
Wirecast.
often talk about in the process of addiction recovery, the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. And the limbic system has some survival components built right into that, one of which is sex itself. Now, some people would question, well, is sex really a survival requirement? You know, is it comparable to, say, air and water and food? And so I guess in terms of literally surviving right now as of
This
this
is a
moment, no,
demonstration
it's
of
not a requirement
Wirecast.
to be in a sexual experience to survive. But the human race is designed to be sexual in order to survive as a race. And so the idea of sexual drive being an important part of our limbic system and our limbic processes is very important for understanding that that is why we have any kind of a sexual impulse. Now, obviously, there are plenty of sexual experiences that we
This is a
experience that
demonstration of
we want to
Wirecast.
experience. Some are unwanted and confusing. And I think that there are those who experience some of the same gender attraction that are confused by that. And they may wonder, well, why is that my experience? Especially if they say, well, I don't want to choose that kind of relationship or choose that kind of life experience. It's sort of like it chose me, so to speak. And so
This is a
while there's
demonstration
a
of
lot to learn in that
Wirecast.
area, I think there's also a lot to be able to explain the fact that we do have a lot of understanding about where sexual impulses come from and why they exist in human beings and how they impact our decision making. It's a very powerful drive, and knowing that whatever the sexual desire is, whatever the sexual attraction is, it comes from that part of our brain that we were designed
This
to
is a
have,
demonstration of
can
Wirecast.
certainly help us in trying to explain things as a matter of literally being an instinct and a survival type of approach in processing our experiences. Now, I think there's a lot of things that we can do to be able to work through the questions that come to those who are confused by a same-gender attraction. And that's something that we do work with people on, is trying to make sense of that, trying to find balance and find peace
This
with the
is a
fact that
demonstration of
one may
Wirecast.
experience a certain impulse or a certain trigger, and they can understand it for what it is, and not be ashamed of that, but also be aware of the fact that decisions can happen in conjunction with those impulses, whether they're in favor of them and supporting them and helping to carry them out, or whether they're actually contrary to those impulses, a decision that would allow you to not carry out that impulse. So hopefully I'm making some sense on that. It's
This is a
definitely
demonstration of
a
Wirecast.
sensitive area where, because we're still learning a lot, we're still trying to be able to make more and more sense of why there are those individuals who do experience the same gender attraction and others who do not. But the bottom line is that limbic part of the brain is essential for understanding any sexual impulse. And if we do understand that, we can feel better about who we are, no matter what our attraction may be, and make sense of it in terms of being able to manage that behavior as
This
human
is a
beings.
demonstration of Wirecast.
Okay, this individual, they've been struggling with masturbation since they were 12 years old, and now they're 23. Because I want to know if it's possible to overcome lust and to be able to spend 5 to 6 months without orgasm, masturbation, or wet dreams, and sex and porn.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think a big part of that question is the fact that it started at a fairly young age and that it has remained
This
with
is
that
a
individual.
demonstration
And
of
so probably a lot of
Wirecast.
that question is, this has been with me for a long time. What can I do to ultimately make a change? And how do I deal with that? So I guess there's a couple components to mention. One is that, at 12 years old, that's a time of great change in life. That's when puberty is really starting to kick in, especially for boys. 12 to 14, that's really when it starts to take hold, and those changes start to happen, where things of a sexual nature
This is a
start to really become
demonstration
an
of
interest.
Wirecast.
And the natural changes, such as the wet dreams, and the discovery of an attraction to um, either the opposite gender or the same gender, in a sexual manner, begins to take form. And so the curiosity is certainly huge at that age. It's kind of a newfound experience. So suddenly you're sort of a young adult with a kind of a children's
This
brain, if
is a
you will,
demonstration of
because
Wirecast.
our logic hasn't developed yet, and so we're not quite sure how to make total sense of all of the physiological and biological changes that are happening at that age. And so we start to experiment, and experimentation and curiosity and just learning more and more about our own bodies as well as the bodies of other people help us to develop that interest as well as that urge. And certainly we discover that certain things feel good and certain things are
This is a
rewarding, and so we start
demonstration
to
of
reward our brains
Wirecast.
as we do experiment and start to receive those rewards in that way. So, and then, transitioning to the question about whether it can be overcome, most definitely it can be overcome. I've seen many people who have been able to identify, why is it that I'm experiencing such a strong desire to do this? Many people do define a lustful feeling as part of their experience, where they're feeling
This
almost
is a
a
demonstration of
insatiable desire to act
Wirecast.
out. And since they don't have necessarily a partner to have a sexual encounter with, and age obviously has a lot to do with that. Also, decisions about pairing up with somebody, but because there's more of an individual experience typically at that age, those habits can form as a simple cycle of triggers and rewards. And but it is definitely possible to work through those things as somebody starts to figure
This
out,
is a
okay,
demonstration of
why do I have
Wirecast.
such an impulse? Um, understanding the natural elements of that, but also understanding that the logic part of our brain takes a while to catch up, and so the ability to master the sexual impulses that come at a young age, it can take some time to learn that and to feel like there's a sense of ability to manage that. It is definitely possible. I've seen lots of people really take hold of those kinds of
This is a
behaviors that seem
demonstration of
nearly
Wirecast.
impossible to get over, and they've been able to find other ways to cope. And I guess the final comment to answer this question would be that oftentimes the sexual response can essentially become a way to cope. And so coping mechanisms, as we understand coping mechanisms, we start to realize that there are certain situations that cause us to want to cope.
This
And in
is a
fact, Tony's showing on
demonstration
the
of
screen right
Wirecast.
now some of the typical scenarios that we experience when we feel the need to cope. So if we're bored, if we're lonely, I hear a lot of clients who talk about feeling a lot of stress, feeling overwhelmed, they're afraid. So those types of emotions and situations can often trigger a desire to cope. And so when we know that a reward is very easy to achieve through a sexual
This is
behavior,
a demonstration
and
of
it's very
Wirecast.
fast to achieve that and to cope, then we can turn to that as a coping mechanism very, very easily. But as we learn other ways to cope with those kinds of difficult emotions and situations, as we learn about trigger management, and as we learn about the scenarios, the life scenarios that are more often causing us those coping situations, we're better able to plan how to deal with those. And so in the course
This
of
is a
learning
demonstration of
coping strategies,
Wirecast.
thought management, and simply understanding the nature of the sexual experience and the sexual impulse, all those things can come together to really help us to manage that behavior over time, and it's certainly possible, definitely.
This next question comes from a spouse who just found out that their husband has been viewing porn, and it's a two-part question. What can she do to help him,
This
and what
is a
can she do
demonstration of
to help
Wirecast.
herself?
Wonderful question. I'm so glad this question came in because it's something that many partners and spouses of those who are struggling with a sexual addiction are afraid to ask, or don't even know that they want to ask, because it's such a difficult topic to get into. Many people in a supporting role, such as a spouse or a partner or a family member,
This is a
are
demonstration
afraid to
of
bring up their own
Wirecast.
needs because of the potential to worsen the situation with their loved one. And they're also afraid to ask how they can support the one who is struggling with addictive behavior because they don't want to worsen it. So it's kind of the same challenge both ways. Is I don't want to worsen the situation. I don't want to trigger him or her. I don't want to create any further problems. I just want to help. So number one, I think I'll answer the question about
This is a
the
demonstration of
supporting
Wirecast.
role, how that supporting person can support the person recovering from addiction effectively. One thing is that one of the very first things that we get into as we meet with spouses and partners of those recovering from addiction is to think about the difference between their behavior and the emotions associated with that and what their actual desires are. Knowing that that
This
person
is a
is
demonstration
not
of Wirecast.
attempting to replace their loved one with that sexual behavior. They're not attempting to substitute for their wife or husband. That's one of the major things that can help the supporting person, but it's also something that can help the person recovering because they're better understood. And another element is the aspect of feeling ashamed of that behavior. Shame is one of the most powerful human emotions that we can experience. It's deeply,
This
deeply
is a
embedded.
demonstration
When we
of
do something that
Wirecast.
we're not proud of, shame can definitely perpetuate the addictive cycle tremendously. It keeps things secret. It keeps things in the dark. It keeps things separate. It keeps us from communicating. And so one of the things that we we talk about a lot with couples as they come together in this process is the idea of being able to communicate more openly about it, not in a shameful way, but in a way that does promote better decisions and
This is a
healthy, open
demonstration of
relationship.
Wirecast.
Honesty is such an important aspect. And so I think understanding the difference between the person's shame and their desire to improve, which we would actually term as guilt, guilt about behavior that they don't want but continue to be engaged in, that can help them, both parties really, feel better about the process that they're engaged in and trying to overcome that process together. So communication is one very important aspect that a supporting person can help
This
with.
is a
Be there
demonstration
for
of
them. Be
Wirecast.
willing to listen. Be willing to simply hear the challenges that they're experiencing without attempting to resolve it, without attempting to cure or give advice, but simply listening. Those are some very important aspects in a supporting role. Now, in terms of the person who is supporting also working through the challenges that they experience, such as a spouse of someone who's recovering from addiction, that spouse also
This
has
is a
very significant
demonstration of
needs. We
Wirecast.
often work with the spouse, both together in a joint session, but also separately, individually, because they do have such very powerful needs in their own way. One of those needs is to feel that they are still loved despite that behavior of the person who's struggling with addiction. I think that's one of the greatest miscommunications and misunderstandings that can happen. So know as a spouse, as a supporting
This
person,
is a
know
demonstration of
that that
Wirecast.
behavior is not intended to replace you. It's not intended to intervene or block that relationship. Know that that is not meant to harm you. Knowing that is a huge benefit to being able to see positive growth opportunities in that recovery process. So I hope I've covered some good ideas for you, but I think bottom line is that the supporting person has a lot of needs as well.
This
There's a
is a
lot of emotions,
demonstration
a
of
lot of things for them
Wirecast.
to work through and process and understand, not only about addiction itself, but also about their relationship and about the emotions that they experience as that process is going on.
I quit using porn and now I feel worse. Is this normal?
That's a really interesting question because there are many who go through a process of change and recovery from addiction
This is a
and will feel
demonstration of
like things are
Wirecast.
really not actually better, even though the behavior management is actually better. And what's interesting, we kind of refer to it as being dragged through the mud sometimes because it feels like even though you're working hard and you're finding some success in managing the unwanted addictive behavior, it also feels like you feel empty at times. You feel isolated, maybe misunderstood, or maybe like you've given up some of the rewarding
This is a
elements of life, and that
demonstration of
you don't really know
Wirecast.
how else life can be rewarding. I kind of like to use an analogy where, let's say, you lived in a place that was extremely hot. Let's say I don't know, Arizona or Mexico or Ecuador or somewhere where the average temperature is much higher than, say, where we are in Utah. And as you get acclimated to that temperature, a higher temperature is going to feel more normal than a
This
colder
is a
temperature. And then
demonstration
if you
of
come back to a colder
Wirecast.
temperature, you're going to be cold. You're going to feel the effects of that because you're not acclimated to that cold temperature. So the reason why I use that analogy is because as you're changing behaviors and you're looking for new ways of coping, the brain has to kind of acclimate to the new kinds of strategies that you're using in your life to cope. And so often it can feel like, well, this is too hot or too cold, and I'm not too satisfied with what I'm experiencing right now. And so literally the brain has to make some adjustments and
This is a
heal
demonstration of
over time to
Wirecast.
be able to kind of find the same, or not, I wouldn't say the same, but to find rewards in normal life experiences that are not addictive behaviors. So that acclimation, there's actually a term that that some people may have heard of called neuroplasticity. It's literally the process of changing the brain, the neural connections in the brain, to allow new processes to take form. In other words, being
This
able
is a
to
demonstration
change
of
behaviors
Wirecast.
in certain situations, going from an addictive behavior to a more healthy coping behavior, and to be able to feel rewarded and to feel happy, to feel peace after such a change takes place can take some time. It can take some acclimation, if you will, for that brain process to start to take hold, and it can be something that might be frustrating for a time because it feels like the rewards have gone away in a lot of
This is
ways,
a
and
demonstration of
that you're searching for
Wirecast.
new ways to reward yourself. Really, it's more about the brain acclimating again to some of the natural rewards of life that are separate from addictive behavior. I hope that helps answer that question.
How do I cope with porn flashbacks, with images that keep coming back after they are trying to quit?
What an awesome question that is, too. That is wonderful because I think that's important for those who are further
This
along in
is
the
a
change
demonstration of
process to be able to
Wirecast.
understand. So, just real quickly, a reason why that happens is that the limbic system, as I've mentioned a few times tonight, has built within it not only the emotions and the survival instincts, but it also has the memories attached in that process. Those are the neural connections within that part of the brain that cause us to have memories. And because the memories are tied
This
into the
is a
emotions and
demonstration of
the
Wirecast.
impulsive area of the brain, the reward center of the brain, um, definitely the brain is going to call upon those memories in a very powerful way at times as it tries to sort of talk you into engaging in that behavior. Um, it's true that simply remembering an image can bring a reward. And so that is something that can happen very, very definitely for a long period of time,
This
even
is a
after the
demonstration of Wirecast.
addictive behavior has stopped. So one of the things that we would talk about in terms of being able to manage that and deal with that is to engage in healthy coping behaviors. Um, so, for example, if we find that we are continually recalling a specific image or a certain type of image, and that is, triggering and it's difficult and it's upsetting, something that we can do is we can start to plan some ways to
This
deal with
is a
those, just as
demonstration
we
of
would a trigger,
Wirecast.
just as we would an impulse to act out on an addictive behavior. So, for example, some people may find that their memory is most often coming to them in situations when they are feeling lonely or tired. And so because they're lonely or tired, they have the chance to ponder and go into those memories more. And so something that we would probably work on is a plan for engaging the thinking part of the brain far more
This is a
at that moment
demonstration
so
of
that
Wirecast.
the thinking part of the brain can start to help us work through other things, start to gain control of our thoughts, start to gain control of the situation, kind of be in the moment and understand what it is, but be able to engage in specific intentional activities so that we are able to move past the impulsive memories that are coming up. So that's just one quick example. There are many
This
examples,
is a
but in
demonstration of
therapy, I think one of the huge
Wirecast.
benefits of therapy is to be able to talk through in detail what exactly that individual is experiencing and when. And as a result of finding out when it's happening, you can start to form plans for dealing with those moments. Be intentional, be in the moment in terms of helping the thinking part of the brain to, again, take charge of the situation and move forward from there.
Here we've got somebody who's sounds like they're trying to hold on. They're saying,
This is a
"Must I
demonstration
destroy and
of
delete all my
Wirecast.
porn?"
So was the question, do I need to destroy all of the porn?
Yes, it sounds like he has or he or she has a stash, and he's wondering if they need to destroy it or delete it all.
Okay, I see. Well, I guess my immediate thought on that is that it certainly would be helpful in terms of being able to manage an addictive behavior if that is an addictive
This is
behavior
a
that you're
demonstration
experiencing
of
or have experienced in the
Wirecast.
past. Um, it's kind of like if somebody is addicted to a substance, alcohol or drugs, for example, if they remove that from their environment, they're going to be far more able to handle those triggers and temptations to use that than they would be if they were sitting in a bar or sitting next to someone that was going to provide the drugs that they wanted. So obviously, the ability to manage that behavior is going to be stronger if you're not in a
This is
situation
a
where you're immediately
demonstration of
tempted to look at something.
Wirecast.
Um, so that would be a help. Now, at the same time, I would say that because sexual behavior and sexual urges are a human instinct, um, I would also mention that that's not necessarily the only thing that would need to be done in order to manage that sexual addiction, because it's a part of us, and obviously we live in a world in which many things are very
This is a
sexualized. Media,
demonstration of
movies
Wirecast.
and music and advertising and all kinds of things are very sexual in nature. Even a simple perusal of the internet or social media can result in seeing something that's even mildly sexually enticing and can draw you in. And so I think knowing that, not just getting rid of the immediate risk, the immediate source of unwanted behavior is the answer. But I think additionally there are other things to
This is
do
a
to be
demonstration of
aware that
Wirecast.
the sexual impulse, number one, is part of us, and so we have to be able to manage that regardless of what's around us, knowing that there will always be content around us that could be sexually appealing to us. But number two, knowing that, yeah, the more you do avoid the content and not have the content available to you, the easier it will be for you to manage the impulses around that.
I have a therapist who I really
This
like and
is a
is helping me
demonstration
in
of
other ways,
Wirecast.
but they don't know how to help me with pornography addiction. What can I do to help them help me?
That's a really good question as well. I'm so glad that we have such a willingness to ask some of these tough questions. The truth is that there are many great therapists out there who are not as familiar with how to deal with the idea of pornography addiction or other sexual addictions. Um, One reason for that is
This
because
is a demonstration of
it isn't
Wirecast.
necessarily defined as an addiction by many people, and so therefore it's not necessarily um, studied or worked on tremendously by a lot of the therapists out there. Um, so that's one reason why there are therapists who aren't as familiar with how to help with that. And I think it's also something that is fairly specialized. Most therapists these days are finding a niche, what they're really good at, what they understand really
This
well,
is a
and
demonstration of
they stick with that. And
Wirecast.
so other areas such as sexual addiction, pornography addiction, may not be an area of expertise for them. So, as an example, somebody might be really good at working with depression or anxiety. Maybe they're good at helping somebody with eating disorders or relationship problems, but they're not good at working on that pornography addiction. And I do think that it is something that you can benefit greatly from reaching out to somebody
This
who
is a
has
demonstration of
studied that
Wirecast.
specific area more and has more expertise in working with people who struggle with that issue. So I guess the short answer is not every therapist is able to help with pornography addiction. Um, there are many who would probably do well to refer out that kind of help to those who are more familiar with it, more experienced with it, and understand that better. And certainly we're happy to help with that if possible. And there are other good therapists too, but we're
This
certainly
is a
helpful
demonstration
or
of
willing to help
Wirecast.
in that area because it is a very specialized area and it's being recognized more and more, but it hasn't been as widely recognized throughout the world um, historically. So I think that's one of the reasons for that.
I want to stop viewing porn. I want to give it up bad, but I feel so sad about giving it up. Why?
Another great question. Um,
This is a
I
demonstration
have
of
experienced that
Wirecast.
with a number of people with whom I have worked in therapy. They feel like it's difficult to actually face the idea of giving it up. One of the reasons for that is because it is a very rewarding experience. It's very rewarding to be able to act out and to give the pleasure center of the brain that experience. We have chemical releases that are going on in the brain, and to put it bluntly, they feel good when they're
This is a
experienced. You
demonstration
know, the
of
dopamine,
Wirecast.
the adrenaline, the oxytocin, the serotonin, all those kinds of chemical changes that take place in the brain when we go through a sexual experience provide a very positive experience, at least in that moment. Now, afterwards, that usually changes. Usually, there's a different feeling of sorrow and guilt or shame or both, and other feelings of being isolated, being lonely, and so forth. But because of the nature of the fact that
This
it's
is a
so rewarding in
demonstration
that
of
moment,
Wirecast.
and it's such a the build up to that moment is also very um, uh, enjoyable. You know, the thrill, so to speak, of inching closer to a sexual experience is enough that it feels like we really want that, and that is an instinctual response that we're going to have. So to face the idea of giving that up can be really daunting
This is
because
a
we're
demonstration of
often not sure that we'll be
Wirecast.
able to feel the same kinds of rewards in other areas of our life. Um, so a few minutes ago, I mentioned the idea of sort of acclimating to a new temperature, meaning that we are able to adjust to receiving rewards and experiencing rewards in normal life activities that are not addictive activities. And so we're able to adapt and feel rewarded even though we're not acting out in that sort of addictive behavior. It's hard to grasp that idea
This is a
when one is
demonstration of
considering change.
Wirecast.
And so I think because it's hard for that, it can be very difficult to find the motivation. Usually, the negative consequences of continued addictive behavior eventually outweigh the desire to sort of keep that reward, and those negative consequences start to cause an imbalance, and then change is wanted. But I can definitely speak after having worked with a lot of people on this that they are able to find
This is a
other
demonstration of
or I should say, they're
Wirecast.
able to find rewards that are rewarding in other ways. And even in a sexual way, there are rewards that come as well, even if the addictive behavior stops. But with sexual behavior with a loved one, um, the rewards can also be very wonderful and can help take care of that sort of experience sadness, if you will, of the prospect of change. So I hope that made sense. I'm not sure if I was very articulate on that answer, but
This
hopefully
is a
that makes some sense.
demonstration of Wirecast.
What can I do if I relapse or am in danger of relapsing?
Wonderful question. My first thought on that is to simply reach out to somebody for help. Um, Reaching out has a lot of really great effects. It helps us to feel like we're supported. It helps us to feel like we are um, not alone in facing addictive behavior and recovery. Um,
This is a
and it helps us to
demonstration of
understand that
Wirecast.
the ability to connect with other people is in itself a rewarding experience. So that connection can actually help us to feel that reward, that sense of security, that sense of peace and happiness. Um, and that reward can actually be very helpful in overcoming the the feeling of being close to relapse. So reaching out to others, I think, is one huge step that's very helpful. Talk to somebody you trust. Um,
This
Even
is a
if you don't
demonstration
necessarily
of
reveal
Wirecast.
every detail of what you're experiencing, which sometimes can keep us from reaching out to others, we don't necessarily have to share every detail about it. You know, we don't have to reach out to a spouse or a friend or a parent um, and tell them exactly what we're feeling. We can use other language that just says, hey, we need help. So, for example, I could reach out and say, I'm just struggling right now for a few minutes. I'm kind of in a bad moment, and I just wanted to reach out and talk to somebody. I just need
This
somebody to
is a
kind of talk
demonstration
to me
of
right now and help me through a
Wirecast.
difficult moment and kind of reassure me and help me through this. And there's not even a need to be detailed about that. I think that can be a huge help because so many of those who struggle with recovery and the potential for relapse feel like they have to be totally open and communicate every vivid detail of what they're experiencing, and they're ashamed to do that. So they don't, and that can be something that hinders the
This
recovery
is a
process,
demonstration of
and relapse can
Wirecast.
often follow. So be willing to be real and reach out for help, but at the same time know that it doesn't really matter if you're sharing the details of what you're struggling with. Just be real and say, hey, I need some help. Can you just talk to me for right now? I need someone to share this moment with me and help me through this. And then, of course, there are other things that you can do besides reaching out to other people. Um, you can also engage in healthy behaviors that you plan on in
This is
advance
a demonstration
when
of
you are
Wirecast.
likely to experience a trigger and the potential for relapse is there. Some people will turn to exercise or they'll turn to a social event or something that is a healthy behavior that they can simply rely on as something that feels good and appropriate and helpful. It gives them the strength to be able to move forward without actually relapsing.
I was also going to say one of the things that a lot of people have used
This is a
as one of their
demonstration of Wirecast.
coping I guess not coping mechanism, but as a strategy that when the trigger comes, because they come to everybody, but is to
Yeah,
reach out and help somebody. Not even necessarily to reach out for help for yourself, but reach out and help somebody else. Because then we engage our prefrontal cortex and we start thinking about other people instead of our own wants and desires at that moment.
yeah, that's a great point, Tony. I like that too.
This
That's
is a
another reason why
demonstration of
connecting with other people
Wirecast.
in a difficult moment can be helpful. That's very clear.
I need porn to calm me down or help me to go to sleep. What can I do when I'm trying to stop?
Very good question. I love that question because it's based on someone's real experience, and I know I've heard that so many times from people as they say, this helps me to relax. This helps me to deal with life. It helps me to just work through things that are
This is a
stressful and difficult,
demonstration of
and I
Wirecast.
need it as a coping mechanism. Well, the truth is we do need to find coping mechanisms, but it is possible to find other ways to cope with that. One of the things that I like to talk about with clients a lot is the idea of being very mindful. There's a technique in therapy called mindfulness, which is based on basically slowing things down in our lives to the point where we can really focus on the here and now. We can focus on the physical experience of our life in that very moment.
This is a
Literally,
demonstration of
to the point of
Wirecast.
focusing on even our breathing and the sound of what we're hearing, and gently recognizing the thoughts that we're experiencing to be able to see them, acknowledge them, and gently kind of push them out of the way so that we can still be in that moment. There is great power in being able to slow down and be mindful of our physical experience in that moment. And I use the term slow down especially because it's so
This is a
important to be able
demonstration of
um,
Wirecast.
to allow the logical part of the brain, the thinking part of the brain, to have a chance, to have a fighter's chance, if you will. If we're very limbic oriented, meaning that we're trying to deal with something in a very limbic way, um, then the chances of us being able to change that behavior are pretty slim just because it's so automated. It's such an instinctual thing. But when we start to slow down and realize what
This
we're
is a
experiencing and
demonstration
why,
of
and
Wirecast.
just be in that very, very slow, real moment, we're able to engage our thoughts and our power to be able to make better decisions is going to come to life. So it's amazing how that works. But I do think that there are a lot of mindfulness types of activities. It's a lot like meditation. but there are very mindful-based activities all over the internet. If you want to take a look at some of those, do some searches, safe
This is
searches,
a
if you will,
demonstration of
on
Wirecast.
YouTube and elsewhere on the internet. Look for things like guided mindfulness exercises or mindfulness techniques or things like that to be able to actually find some things that can walk you through literally with somebody talking you through a mindfulness exercise. That can be a huge help for you.
Does it help to view porn as immoral?
This is a demonstration of Wirecast.
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Does it help to view porn as immoral? Well, I don't know if that's something that I can really answer for the person who's asking that question. I think it really greatly depends on the individual who is trying to work through that challenge, because there are those who do not view pornography as being immoral, and there are those who do view it as being immoral. Either way,
This is a
it can
demonstration
become
of Wirecast.
an addictive behavior in one's life. Um,
They'd
so
have to be kind of careful that it doesn't go into shame, though, correct? If you're viewing it
yeah,
as immoral, I mean, even if you believe it is or you believe it's not, it could still kick you into the shame cycle if you're not careful.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, shame can definitely kick in, especially if it's viewed as something that's immoral. Shame can definitely be even more
This is a
pronounced because
demonstration
you
of
feel like you're doing
Wirecast.
something that's not only unwanted, but it's also unacceptable. And so I think that's a very important difference to make. Or sorry, a different point to call out is that if somebody does view it as immoral, it's considered unacceptable, and therefore the shame is very intense. Um, so, while I cannot dictate whether a person views it as immoral or not, what I can speak to is the fact that it's something that can be
This
disruptive
is a
and be damaging to
demonstration of
people, regardless of their
Wirecast.
work and just coping with other challenges of life. Often people who are experiencing the addictive elements of pornography also feel very depressed. They might feel
Of
so many of those.
Wirecast.
Most of all, it would help to view it as something that's potentially disruptive to your life, if in fact you feel like it is disruptive to your life. Um, so again, going back to everyone has to decide for themselves whether they view it as moral or immoral. The bottom line is that
This is
it
a
does create
demonstration of
disruption and
Wirecast.
problematic tendencies that can be very disruptive in life, and it also can change our ability to connect with other people. It can change our ability to find rewards in a different kind of sexual experience. For example, being intimate with a spouse, that experience can be greatly impacted by a pornography addiction. So knowing that it can be so disruptive and change the way we view other elements of life is probably a better way to look at the
This is a
impact of it.
demonstration of
There's
Wirecast.
kind of a follow-up question to that. He wants to know, is it bigger challenge for religious people?
Oh, okay. Very good question. Um,
So I guess
I
that
would
kind of
I would
follows up
say
why
that
he thinks it's immoral. He's wondering that balance because he is a religious person.
okay. So yeah, so being a religious person, does that make the recovery process more difficult? Um, I would say in some
This is a
ways it can
demonstration of
increase the
Wirecast.
shame that we feel. If we feel like we are um, not only doing something that we don't like, but that is unacceptable, as I've said before, if we view it as something that is sinful or contrary to our value system, our religious beliefs, then that's likely to increase the shame that we feel, and that can be a more difficult barrier to overcome. On the other hand, I would also say that if someone's religious, then their
This
faith
is a
in a supreme
demonstration of
being
Wirecast.
is going to be a strength to them. Because in addiction recovery, we talk about an idea called surrendering, and as you've got Tony on the screen right now, The idea of surrender is that you acknowledge an overwhelming ability for what we call the addictive behavior, uh, the limbic response to a situation. We allow it we recognize that it
This is a
has tremendous
demonstration of
influence on us
Wirecast.
if we allow it to. And we know that it does have tremendous power, and we recognize that influence in our lives. But on the other hand, by surrendering to that acknowledged force, we also empower ourselves. Kind of ironically, I guess, in a way, we empower ourselves because of that surrendering. We empower ourselves to say, I know that it has the ability to have a tremendous power over me, but I know because of it
This
that I
is
can
a
also
demonstration of
recognize it for what it
Wirecast.
is and find ways to overcome it. So, so I definitely feel like those who are religious and turn to a higher power as a source of strength in their life, they do have an additional strength in that battle to be able to find more strength beyond their own, um, and they find a lot of success as they do lean on that extra help.
Okay, well, we are approaching our hour. Actually, we are at our hour. Do you have
This
time for
is a
one more question?
demonstration of Wirecast.
Okay.
Okay. First, we want to thank everybody for attending tonight and for these questions. They've definitely put Tori to work in answering them, and especially on the
Yeah.
fly. That's what's always so fun about this. You never know what you're going to get. But this last question
Right.
here, which I think a lot of people can relate to, he says, well, what do I do when I have so much sexual energy? What do I do with it? What do I do?
Oh, that's
This
another
is a
really good question.
demonstration
I'm
of
so grateful that everybody's
Wirecast.
willing to submit these questions. It's awesome. So what do you do with so much sexual energy? It's interesting because there are some people who have a far more active sex drive than others, and so they're far more inclined to be looking for sexual experiences than others. It's just kind of an interesting way that we're naturally composed, if you will, or naturally wired within our brains and our physical bodies.
This
And
is a
so something
demonstration of
that we often talk
Wirecast.
about is simply being able to engage in behaviors that we are finding as being in alignment with um, our value system and also our responsibilities, essentially. So, in other words, if we have a significant other with whom we have a sexual relationship, certainly engaging in that kind of an intimate relationship can be a healthy behavior um,
This
in
is a
terms of being able
demonstration of
to
Wirecast.
experience the sexual drive that or act on that sexual drive that we're experiencing. But also, there are other behaviors that we can start to implement in our lives that are very helpful. One of the things that I like to talk about is acceptance of it. Number one, being able to say, hey, it's great that my body's working. It's great that I have a sexual instinct that is strong and healthy and powerful. Isn't that wonderful that
This
I'm
is a
wired that way and that I'm
demonstration of
able to
Wirecast.
feel that, and my body is working the way it was designed to work. So acceptance of it is, I think, one of the very important things, and we can feel a lot of positive emotions around that if we accept it in that way, and that's a huge help. And then number two would be just some other healthy behaviors that can be rewarding in other ways. Um, Finding ways to connect with people in a non-sexual way can be very rewarding too, and it can help us
This
to
is
be
a
able to balance
demonstration of Wirecast.
the ongoing sexual drive that we do experience. Um, so connecting with other people, finding activities that are rewarding to us in healthy ways that are acceptable, and that we feel good about as a way to balance out those sexual drive experiences that can be helpful too. I think it's kind of interesting is if you sit and think about something all the time, it essentially becomes everything that you do, right? If that's all you think about, it's front and center in
This
your
is a
mind all the time,
demonstration of
and it can be a bigger
Wirecast.
challenge. Whereas if it's not something that you're always focused on, it can be better managed. And so I think, truth is, when we work with someone who's trying to recover from addiction, We talk about a lot of different things. We don't just talk about addictive behavior because there are other things that are relevant in that person's life. And so I think being able to say, well, yeah, sexual drive is a big part of who I am, but it's not all I am. There are other aspects of your life that you can
This is a
also focus on and be
demonstration of
rewarded by.
Wirecast.
We could talk through different ways to do that, but I think that's something that could be helpful as well.
Well, thank you very much, Troy. We appreciate you taking your time tonight to answer these questions. We appreciate everybody joining us. I want to leave with this last slide. I love this slide because it's so true. One time is too many, and 1,000 times is never enough. We can never get enough of what we don't need.